to the Equestrian Queensland Fundamental Series. I'm Tani McCormack, Senior Sport Development Officer at Equestrian Queensland and Director of the series. First of all, congratulations on beginning your journey with your new off-the-track horse. This series has been designed to support you in successfully transitioning your horse from the racing industry, promoting high-quality healthcare and retraining foundations.
We thank QRIC, the Queensland Racing Integrity Commission, for funding this project through their Racing Animal Welfare Grants program. We are proud to support the promotion of life after racing. To follow the full series and for more resources, go to the Equestrian Queensland website and click on EQ Fundamental Series under the Education tab or follow the link below.
Hello, my name's Shane Gillard and I'm Queensland's Racing Integrity Commissioner. I'm pleased to introduce this Equestrian Queensland video series, which has been funded through the QRIC Equine Welfare Racing Animal Welfare Grants Program. Established in 2016, the Queensland Racing Integrity Commission is an independent statutory body which oversees the integrity and welfare standards of racing animals and participants in Queensland. Partnerships are critical to how we work at the Commission, specifically to ensure that the rules of racing are upheld and to safeguard the welfare of racing animals to ensure that everyone can compete on an even playing field. This successful QRIC Rural Grant Program has assisted Equestrian Queensland to develop these educational training videos to demonstrate important aspects of acquiring, assessing and re-educating retired racehorses to prepare them for their first equestrian sport competition. These videos raise the profile of alternative career opportunities for retired thoroughbred and standardbred horses and educate those in the market to purchase a retired racehorse in Queensland.
Hi and welcome to the Equestrian Queensland Fundamental Series, proudly supported by QRIC, where we are today looking at saddle fitting, and I'm the saddle fitter, Kathryn Sullivan-Butt, and what I'd like to do is talk to you today about the needs of the thoroughbred horse as we merge from the racing industry and going into other sports, performance sports such as showing, jumping, dressage and eventing, and how the saddle fitting needs of those horses changes, because as they change shape we also need to accommodate those needs to look after the welfare of our horses. My history in the industry is I've been a saddle fitter for over 20 years. I'm qualified with the Society of Master Saddlers in England, plus I hold various other qualifications. I am also a qualified coach in dressage, so I'm an EQ qualified dressage coach. And one of the reasons that I got into saddle fitting was that I found as a coach, so often I couldn't accommodate the needs of the horse purely in a lesson alone when the saddle wasn't working for the horse. And when we managed to tweak, change the saddle, or even just change the padding on the saddle, all of a sudden we had a horse that was happier and worked better. And one thing that I have found over many years is seeing the changing thoroughbred shapes as they come into a different format of sport, and how changing the saddle, even a small amount, has made a dramatic impact for those horses. And that's what I want to share with you today, because you can do something very small that can make a big difference to your horse. So today we are focusing a little more on the English disciplines, dressage, showing, jumping. Of course, though, your off-the-track horse could end up going and doing trail riding, pleasure riding, even Western type events. One thing to be aware of, though, is look at the saddles that are going to go on your horse. A lot of Western saddles can be made to accommodate the thoroughbred horse or the off-the-track horse, but a lot of Western saddles are also made on quarter horse bars. So they're designed for the bigger, rounder horse. So be very careful if that's the type of saddle that you're looking at, that you do have one that suits the needs of your horse. Alternatively, a lot of stock saddles go back to thoroughbred lineage with the stock horses, so they may actually be an alternative that will work for your horse for your trail riding option. Today we are going to focus more on the English saddles, the jump saddles and the dressage saddles. having those different saddles for the different disciplines does mean as a rider you have an advantage. It's easier to sit in the correct position in the saddle that places you. A jump saddle will help you get into the 2-point position and over a jump, and a dressage saddle will help you sit deeper and more classical positions such as the dressage seat. You can have saddles that do both, but to actually optimize your riding, you'll find the saddle that is designed to put you in the right position will be easier for you and easier for your horse as well. Okay, so for someone who's now looking at the exciting prospect of taking on an ex-racehorse, what you do need to consider is, has your horse actually been saddled in a saddle that it's comfortable with and used to? So many ex-race horses will have been in harness if they've been a standard bred and a trotter. Other horses you might find have been racing and they would have been racing in a racing pad. Now, a racing pad with a thick pad underneath, and very often lightweight jockeys or track riders, is a very different saddle than the saddle that you'll be putting on if you intend to use your horse for other aspects such as showing, jumping and dressage, and eventing of course too. So one of the main differences between a racing pad, and this is for a dressage saddle, is the tree itself, and this is what's inside the saddle, is very different between the two saddles. And it is as different for the horse as wearing a pair of stilettos and a pair of joggers. So just like some girls and some guys can't walk around in a pair of stilettos, what you've got to do is help your horse retrain them to the different feel of a different saddle on their back. So looking at this, we actually have the whole idea of the tree is to disperse your weight along the horse's back. And it's a little bit heavier than a racing saddle, and it does have quite a bigger panel as well. The whole saddle itself is of course heavier, because when we're looking at the horse for other performance sports, the weight of the saddle is not such a factor as what it is in racing. So let's look at some different saddles and different styles of saddles that accommodate the needs of a racing horse post-racing and coming back into a different sport. Okay, so when we're looking at different saddles for the racing horse, it actually comes down to the shape of your individual horse, and that shape will change as you bring your horse into the different needs for your sport. Some horses that are going into a sport such as dressage, and certainly a sport such as showing, will tend to bulk up a little bit more. Just like a guy going to a gym won't be able to wear the size small shirt he used to wear, he'll need something a little bit bigger. Your horse, when he's getting that carrying capacity, such as a dressage horse or that bigger show horse shape, is going to need a saddle that allows for that bigger shape. Alternatively, a lot of your eventing horses, they're the athletes that have to be a little bit, they're going long distances, so they're a little bit carrying less weight. They may actually fine up, and when they build up top line, they'll still be eventing fit, so they won't be quite as big and as muscled as, say, your equivalent dressage horse. So the sport that you're taking your racing horse into will determine how their body shape changes, and what you need to do as the owner and the rider is to make sure that your horse is going to be comfortable through those changes, going from racing fit to performance fit. If you have a look here, we've got an array of different saddles. Some of these saddles are for all different shaped horses. One thing that I do like for a horse that's going to change a lot is you can either look at a panel underneath that's a nice big thick panel like this, so I as your saddle fitter or your saddler can come along and they can adjust how much flocking or wool is inside this panel. So as your horse gets wider, we can take a little bit of the flock out, and as your horse, maybe if they're fitting up and getting a little bit narrower, we can actually give them a little bit more support so that they're never feeling along their spine the weight of the rider. So the whole purpose of your saddle is to take your weight off the horse's spine and let it be carried along the longissimus muscles and either side the muscular structure of your horse. If you go to a saddle that has a foam panel or a close contact saddle, they also work really well for the performance horse. But what you have to do is look at the padding that you're using with it, because what you may do is go from a thick padding to a thin padding, or the other way around, depending on how your horse changes shape. So another saddle that we can look at, and this is a jumping saddle. And again, really doesn't matter what cover's on top. When we're looking at what's going to work for your horse, we're looking at how much support are they getting underneath. And you can see this saddle here has got a lot of support. This would work for a thoroughbred that, say, had a little bit of atrophy behind the scapula, where the trapezius area needs a little bit of building up. And this saddle could help give that support, help keep your weight off the horse's spine. Another saddle, and you'll probably see when you're out and about various different horses show jumping. This saddle here is a foam panel saddle. And again, it's got some features that I do like for the thoroughbred. It's got this drop panel there, so that gives a little bit more support. Some saddles will come up here, and they work for the horse that's got a really built up top line, not necessarily for a horse that needs a little bit more support. This particular saddle has also been made for a horse that's high in the wither and then drops down behind, because it has more panel support at the back. So this helps keep clearance over a high wither. And the last thing you want is for your horse that's trying to do performance, go out there and jump for you, is to end up being cracked in the wither from the saddle. So these sorts of features, having a bit more support underneath in conjunction with the right pad, will really help your horse perform his best. So this here again is a drop panel, which has got a little bit more support for the horse that needs it. Typically a thoroughbred, but you can also get really round thoroughbreds. So I'm talking about the typical A-frame thoroughbred. And where we talked about the wool, you can actually see here the wool that's inside the panel. And this will be added to or taken away according to the needs of your horse. And that may work for some horses to have a wool flocked panel, and other horses it may work well to have the different shims that you can use. Another consideration that we have to have with our horses when we're fitting them is where their girth groove is. And typically a lot of performance thoroughbreds, and particularly those in the show jumping, can actually have a rearward girth groove. That means that it's further back. So on that sort of horse, we would actually choose the two rear points so that the girth aligns with where their girth groove is. And if we had another horse that had a bit of a drop belly and a forward girth groove, we may use this forward point to help secure the saddle, and the second or the third point as well. So really how we girth our horse up depends on the girth groove location of the horse, and having a saddle that will allow you to adjust where you do up the girth will really help in keeping that saddle stable. So when, as a saddle fitter, I come in to have a look at a horse, there's quite a few parts of the horse that I'm focusing on, how we can make the saddle fit, or what is the right saddle for the shape of your horse. So I look at this guy here, and he's a fairly typical thoroughbred shape, a little bit of A-frame, somewhat high wither. This guy has a decent length of back, but don't be fooled, you can have an 18-hand horse that has a really short back. So don't think just because you've got a big horse they're going to have a long back. But this guy's got a fairly decent area for me to work as a saddle fitter to accommodate the needs of his rider. So one of the things I'm looking at is the scapula coming around here. And so when I'm templating a horse and getting their measurements, the first measurement that I take is 2 fingers behind the scapula, because this here is where the front of the saddle or the bar of the saddle goes. So the measurement that we get from this side over to the other side, it might be here, it might be here on the different size horses, and we have to accommodate that with the needs of the tree or the saddle of the horse that it fits. The other thing that I'm looking at is how long is his back. So for that, I'm going back to the last rib, and the last rib coming in on the 18th thoracic vertebrae. So this is the area where we can sit the saddle. The reason that we don't go past the 18th rib, we don't go past the 18th thoracic vertebrae, is because then the saddle is sitting too long on the horse's back and it's sitting at the lumbar vertebrae. and the horse isn't designed to carry an English saddle there. There is some debate whether or not Western saddles can sit a little bit further behind that point, but we won't go into that today because what we're looking at is where the English saddles are sitting here on him. So just drawing in white so it's a little bit easier to see. Now you can actually see as he stamps his foot up and down, you'll actually see quite a lot of movement in this shoulder here. So that you can understand when you see that movement, we don't want the saddle sitting here, A, because the horse will have restricted movement in the shoulder, but also the saddle is then going to rotate back and forth, uncomfortable for the horse and unsafe for the rider. So it is important that we sit the saddle in the correct place behind the scapula, 2 fingers behind the scapula. Going back up from the 18th rib, following that up to the 18th thoracic vertebrae. So this is now the area that we're looking at in length that we can position a saddle. One area that we want to keep free of any sort of contact is in this area here. If we have a saddle that sort of pinches up close to the spine of the horse, particularly laterally as well as on top, then you're going to find a very uncomfortable horse. So we need to keep these areas clear laterally either side of the spine. And we certainly don't ever want the saddle sitting on the spine at any point, because that could make a very good horse become very nasty quickly because they would be in a lot of pain. And that's our job, fitting, and both as riders and owners, to keep our horses happy and comfortable. Here we're looking at a different tree for different saddles. For this horse, when I look at this tree on his shape, immediately I know this saddle isn't going to suit this horse. A, it's far too wide, and it is, that could be made wider at this point, but you look at the way that it sits, it doesn't really match his contours. So a saddle made on this tree is never really going to work for a horse this shape. We look at a different tree, and we place him down on his back. We can see here it's still a little bit wide, but that's not too bad. The contours match far better along the shape of his back as we go down. We are on a little bit of an angle here in the wash bay, but what this does show you is the tree can match the contours, and if you get that right, then straight away you're going to be a lot closer to the right saddle for the horse. And then as he changes shape and adapts, because we're already fundamentally at his shape, we can make tweaks and changes to the saddle that will work as the horse changes shape, provided he doesn't change shape too dramatically. So when I was talking before about the width in front, this is where we take this measurement here. And this bar can be adjusted in a press in some saddles for the adjusting needs of your horse, a little bit like a belt. After Christmas holidays, you might need a little bit longer belt. When you come into the start of the holidays, you might be able to do up a few more holes. This will change with horses. So you can either flock up and use shims, which we'll discuss later, or you can change the bar in some saddles, or you can adjust this, press it in or out. Saddles that have an adjustable bar look something like this. And these are things that your saddle fitter will put on top. So this guy here, that's about the right size bar for him. We could look at another bar, and you can see just looking at that there, that a saddle with this bar on this horse is going to have no lateral support. It's going to move around, and it's probably going to end up sitting on his spine, which is the last thing that we want. So it is very important that we don't have a bar too wide like that, but also we don't want a bar too tight, because it will push in here and actually make this horse start to have pressure and sore at this area here, so he won't be comfortable. Okay, so again, what we're looking at is when we put the saddle on, is we want to bring it back behind that scapula. We do have a little bit of a downward slope here in the wash base, so we're not getting the right angle looking at the top. But we sit the saddle down in, and I have a little feel underneath. And because this is a close contact saddle and he's a fairly finely built horse, we want to give him a little bit more body, a bit more support underneath. So we're going to do that today with a memory foam pad that has really good wicking away ability, keeps the sweat wicking away. So that's a really nice, comfortable pad for this horse, and it will give him that support. So when we're looking at the saddles, we're allowing for the fact that he could potentially change shape. So we want a saddle that will work for him as he builds up. So at the moment, we're using a thicker pad to give that extra support. So there's a million different pads that we can use to give horses support. Some are better than others. One thing that is an old myth, which is well and truly being busted, is if the saddle fits, you don't need to use a fluffy or a sheepskin. So the science has come in that the horses actually have less peak pressure underneath the saddle when we use a fluffy with a well-fitting saddle. And that's a sheepskin. It molds to the horse's shape a little bit. It allows, being a natural fibre, for sweat to wick away. And most horses do have added comfort with it. It is something, though, when you're using the different pads, you do want to work with your saddle fitter to make sure that you're using the correct pad for your horse and it's not changing the shape, the fit of the saddle, unless you actually are using it to help give a little bit of boost with the different saddles. One thing I do think with these thoroughbred shaped horses, we want pads that accommodate the wither. And if you have a look, this pad's got good shaping at the front to allow for the wither. And as well, this one here is a different style. This one again. So one thing about this particular pad is it opens up so that we can give extra support to the front or to the back and shim according to the needs of the horse. Or we can just put a really generous memory foam in that can add a little bit of comfort for the horse, take away from concussive pressures, can sometimes help with the fit of the saddle, can be with a horse that's coming through rehab, can also be for a rider that lands a little bit heavier in the saddle. We give the horse a bit of comfort on their back. But one thing to take away, if you're looking at an ex-racehorse, thoroughbred, or a standard bred, invariably you'll find they often do have a little more prominent wither. So you do want to have a pad that allows for that. Of course, you could have a thoroughbred or a standard bred that doesn't have a prominent wither, and that's not going to matter for the fit if it's got that extra shaping. But if they do have it and the pad doesn't, the horse will be uncomfortable. This is a fairly well-shaped pad, nice and high in the wither, comes up behind. If you look at the underneath, the channel is clear, and what that allows, it's a little bit easier to make sure we have spinal clearance. We do have the tabs that you can attach onto your saddle, but if you don't use them, my advice is unpick those and take them off, because even that little amount there can add to a pressure point underneath the saddle. So if it's not being used, that location there can be just a little point of pressure. So a bit like a sock with a burr in it. So another thing that I noticed about this horse is if you have a look, his girth line is back here. So his girth groove is back here, which means when we tack up on the saddle, the girth is going to want to sit a little bit further back. Some horses will come, the girth groove is the part that comes up highest, and the girth is going to want to end up in that area, so that with some horses it can be high here, some horses which would be standard would be high here, and his is what I would consider a rearward girth line rather than a standard or forward girth groove. So this particular horse has changed shape since I've seen him last. We've had a little bit of a change in shape in this part of his back. So it's going to be really interesting looking at him with the rider on board. We may be doing some changes in shimming so that we get the balance right, so that both rider and horse are a lot more comfortable. And we can do small changes that will make a big difference for the horse and rider. So the measurement that we took before, which was 2 fingers behind the scapula, this is typically in that trapezius area where we see the biggest change in the horse. A classic is, I just bought some examples of some thoroughbreds that I fit. Now this particular thoroughbred had been on 1 year spell, and this horse got fat. He was a butterball when he came back into work. So for him, when we first templated him, he came in extremely wide. He was starting to be worked up and getting a venting fit. And so as he fitted up, he actually dropped down to a medium wide fit. Now this change, the yellow that you can see here, was only just a little bit over 3 months later, and that's a really dramatic change. And he'd gone down 1 or 2 gullet sizes in that time as he fitted up. So for this horse, if we had continued with the same saddle and not adjusted anything as he changed shape, he would have ended up in a saddle sitting down on his spine. He would have been really uncomfortable and then started to go backwards in his training. So for him, it clearly becomes important how quickly a horse can change shape and how quickly we need to be there to address it. And particularly when you have a horse that's going from a racing career into a different performance career, you'll see lots of changes. And to work with your saddle fitter, it can be really exciting to see how you're changing his shape and to start to get the measurements that go round his circumference with his belly, the measurements that show these big changes, and you can actually start to know what you need to do to address it. The next horse that we're looking at, and this fellow was 9 years old, and people would say, well, at 9 he shouldn't change shape too much. Well, he changed shape a lot. This particular horse, the second horse, was a 7-year-old mare. And post-racing, she had just sat in the paddock for a little bit and she'd completely lost all top line. So her owner, when she first took ownership of her mare post-racing, she decided to spend the first month doing rehab on the ground, getting the horse lifting up through the back. And you can see in this horse, the measurement went from this first measurement where the horse was quite dipped behind the scapula, needed a lot more support, to the first measurement only a month later where those dips flattened out. At this point, she got approval from her vet and her physio, her horse physio, that we were good to start working under saddle. So we then fitted the horse for a saddle. And again, we're only looking 3 months later, we had another really significant change. With this horse, a different change. This horse was building top line. And again, we had to adapt the saddle and change the saddle to fit the changing needs of the horse. And this is the sort of exciting stuff that happens when you're working and seeing these changes. So it's great to do. But remember, your horses are often coming into saddles for the first time, or certainly into a fully treed saddle. The last thing you want is for their introduction to ridden work to be uncomfortable. And by accommodating this, we can keep your horse comfortable in the saddle so they look forward to being ridden. So it's not that long since Maddie and Dakota last had their last fitting. And in that time, Dakota has changed shape, and that little change in shape that he's had affected what we did for the saddle. So in that 3 to 4 months, with a horse that's changing shape quite rapidly, as a horse coming off the track and getting into a different performance sport will do, these changes will make a big difference. So this is a saddle fitter signing off. I hope you've got something from this. With Equestrian Queensland and the Fundamental Series, what you're learning through this program, supported by QRIC, will help you enjoy your horses more, have your horses more comfortable, and our whole sport and the animals as well will benefit. Thanks for that, guys.